The carriage immediately turned around and drove through Canandaigua, Main Street, northerly. This was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and it was a bright moonlight night. Loton Lawson, Bird Smith, John Whitney, James Gillis, and probably one or two other persons whose name are not known either rode in or accompanied the carriage containing Morgan. It would seem that this carriage was accompanied most of the distance by outriders either on horseback or in some separate conveyance. A sulky with a man on it started from Canandaigua just after the carriage drove through the street, for which it appeared to have been waiting some time. It drove past the carriage about 3 miles from Canandaigua and stopped at Victor overnight. At Victor, the carriage containing Morgan and the party with him drove into Enos Gillis's yard, back of his barn and out of sight of the road, and the party remained there about an hour and took some refreshments. James Gillis here took a horse from his brother's stable, and it would also seem that one other of the party accompanied or preceded the carriage on horseback when it left Victor. On the morning of the 13th of September between 4 and 5 o'clock, Ezra Platt, a livery stable keeper in Rochester and a Royal Ark Mason, was called upon for a carriage to go to Lewistown and requested it to be sent to Ensworth Tavern in the village. He called up Orson Parkhurst, one of his drivers, who was also a Mason, and directed him to prepare the carriage. Platt charged the hire of the carriage as he has sworn to the Grand Chapter Pro Tem. He has not yet received his pay for such a singular charge. The carriage containing Morgan and the party with him drove into Rochester about day dawn, and Hubbard watered his horse at the public reservoir near the center of the village. He has testified that one individual alighted from the carriage here and was absent about 15 minutes when the same person returned as he supposed. The carriage then drove north about 3 miles from Rochester, where the Ridge Road turns off from the River Road. It stopped at the tavern at the intersection of the roads a short time with the intention of feeding. For some reason, this intention was abandoned, and Hubbard drove the carriage about a half a mile from the tavern on the Ridge Road and set down the whole party in the road at a distance from any house and near a piece of wood. The curtains of this carriage, so far as it had been seen by daylight, were closed. After Hubbard had set his party down, he returned with the curtains of his carriage rolled up. Soon after the carriage left the tavern going west, Edward Doyle of Rochester rode up on a horse belonging to Ezra Platt and inquired if such a carriage had passed and which way it went. Being informed, he followed after it. Platt's carriage, driven by Orson Parkhurst with some individuals in it, soon drove on the same road. It took up the party that Hubbard had left in the road, or a portion of them, with Morgan, and drove west. Edward Doyle on horseback and 4 or 5 persons in Hubbard's carriage returned to Rochester. A gentleman of Clarkson had engaged a pair of horses of Silas Walbridge of that place to put before a carriage. The carriage, driven by Parkhurst, drove up to Clarkson about 9 o'clock in the morning with the curtains and windows closed, though it was a warm day. This is about 15 miles west of the place where Parkhurst took in his party. Upon his arrival in the street of Clarkson, the gentleman who had engaged Walbridge's horses told him that he should not want them, and immediately got into a sulky and drove about 2.5 miles further west and engaged a pair of horses of one Captain Isaac Allen, a farmer. The carriage did not stop in Clarkson, but drove on to Allen's. Upon its arrival, Allen's horses were taken out of the orchard where they had been drawing apples, and were harnessed to the carriage which Parkhurst drove in exchange for the horses which he had before driven. And Parkhurst mounted the box again and drove on west. When the carriage arrived at Gaines, about 15 miles west of Clarkson, Elihu Mather, residing at that place, took the horses of his brother James Mather and followed the carriage, which had passed west through the village. He overtook it at some distance from the village, where the horses were exchanged in the street at a distance from any house. When the exchange was effected, Elihu Mather himself got upon the box and drove the carriage west, while Parkhurst returned east with Allen's horses. The stage, which had left Rochester early the same morning, arrived at Murdoch's tavern before the carriage containing Morgan passed. A gentleman of high standing of Rochester was one of the passengers in the stage when the stage arrived at Murdoch's tavern. This gentleman called the man aside who had then had charge of the tavern and asked him if he was a Royal Ark Mason. Being answered in the negative, he asked for writing materials, with which he wrote a note and dispatched a boy with it to Jeremiah Brown, residing in that vicinity. Jeremiah Brown came to the tavern soon after and held a conversation with him. When the stage went on, Brown and the gentleman both went on in it. Soon after, Brown returned to the tavern with 2 horses, riding one and leading the other. When the carriage containing Morgan came along, which was soon after, Elihu Mather, who was then driving it, beckoned to Brown after the carriage had passed the house a short distance, and Brown went up to him and approached to hold some conversation with him. The carriage drove on. Brown took his horses and followed on after it, but it would seem that he left the horses and got on to the carriage himself. Bird Smith had followed the Morgan carriage in a sulky, but he had not overtaken it when the carriage arrived at Murdoch's. The carriage stopped that evening at the tavern of Solomon C. Wright in Newfane, Niagara County, where the road turns off to Lockport and about 3 miles distant therefrom. It was here driven into the barn and the doors closed, and the party remained at this place for some time to procure refreshments and to make arrangements for relieving those who had traveled in the carriage with Morgan all day and the whole of the previous night, and who must necessarily have been greatly fatigued. Bird Smith went on to Lockport in his sulky, and together with Jared Darrow, called before Eli Bruce, the sheriff of Niagara County, and informed him that Morgan was in their possession and was going to Canada, and requested Bruce's assistance in getting him along. Bruce and some others went to Wright's, where several persons were assembled. Bruce and David Haig got into the carriage with Morgan. Elihu Mather drove, and Jeremiah Brown was on the box with him, and they left Wright's about 10 o'clock in the evening. The persons who came there with Morgan, probably most of them, went to Lockport that night and went to Lewistown the next day in a stagecoach. At Molyneux's tavern, 6 miles distant, they stopped, and Bruce procured Molyneux's horses in exchange for Mather's. An individual accompanied the carriage on horseback. Brown then drove, and they reached Lewistown, 14 miles distance from Molyneux, somewhat after midnight. The carriage was driven around to a back street and unharnessed. Samuel Burton, one of the proprietors of the stage line at Lewistown, was called upon for assistance. He called up Corydon Fox, one of his drivers, and directed him to harness the carriage. He did so and drove up to the tavern. Bruce got upon the box with him, and by his direction Fox drove around to the back street where the other carriage was unharnessed. When Morgan was taken out of the one carriage and put into the carriage which Fox drove, Bruce and Haig got in with him, and Fox, by Bruce's direction, drove to Youngstown. They called at the house of Colonel William King of Youngstown and stopped. Bruce alighted and called up King, who came out with Bruce, and both got into the carriage. Fox drove on toward the fort by Bruce's direction, and when they arrived at the burying ground near the fort, he was told to stop. He did so when the persons having Morgan in charge got out, together with Morgan, and all 4 walked off arm in arm toward the fort, and Fox was told he might return. Morgan was hoodwinked and bound at this time. It appears that arrangements had been previously made for the reception of Morgan upon the Grenada side of the river, with persons residing upon that side. Confessions of Henry L. Valance. It is from the time of the arrival at the Fort of Niagara that my connection with this unhappy business more particularly dates. Up to the time of which I am now speaking, I had not been more concerned in it than others. But from some other cause or other, the more daring of the American conspirators, who had resolved in their hearts to go all lengths in the awful path on which they had entered, should it be necessary for their safety so to do, these men, I say, selected me and some few other of the Canadians as persons upon whom they could most rely in the event of their resorting to extremities. They took us into their confidence in a very marked manner, and the consequence was a degree of intimacy far greater than would have followed from the ordinary Masonic tie. We discussed the whole matter and all its bearings, and the death of the offender was darkly and obscurely hinted at in our nocturnal consultations. It did not, however, assume other than a shadowy shape, and the crime itself would have remained unperpetuated had it not been that we had placed ourselves in a position where a feather's weight was sufficient to turn the scale against the life of the victim of a mistaken view of our Masonic obligations. Circumstance in themselves trivial led to the death rather than the continued confinement or banishment of Morgan, as I shall now proceed to show. Morgan, as all the world knows, had been confined in the magazine of Fort Niagara. The keeper of the fort was a Mason and a man upon whom we could most confidently rely, as he had entered heart and soul into the plan of abduction and was ready to go as far as the worst of us for the purpose of preventing Morgan's disclosures, or for punishing a traitor, as we all held Morgan to be. Had he been alone there, all would have gone as well as the most lenient of our number could have desired, but his wife was with him, and it was through her conduct that we felt ourselves compelled to silence him, who could have borne testimony against us had he managed to obtain his freedom. This woman came to the knowledge of the fact that someone was confined illegally at the fort, and she demanded to be made acquainted with the whole circumstance of the transaction in which we were engaged. Her husband not only refused to comply with her request, in the dread that it would lead to the discovery of the entire matter and the arrest and severe punishment of all the parties to it, but he endeavored to enforce silence upon her. This, of course, she being a spirited woman, only rendered things worse. Dispute followed dispute, and one quarrel trod fast in the heels of another until the wife finally left her husband and returned for protection to the house of her father. To her father she communicated the cause of those domestic dissensions which had led to the separation from her husband. He was struck with her narrative and determined, after considerable reflection, to see his son-in-law and to demand an explanation of the mysterious circumstance, rather than make a public affair of what, after all, might prove to be but one of those difficulties which occasionally occur in married life. He said nothing to his daughter, however, of his intended course of action, but proceeded to the fort and saw his son-in-law.